Okay, so these next few terms here, we've already touched on them briefly, but I'll just reiterate what they mean because they relate to what we've already been talking about. Recursive dissociation, that is, speaking of fracta, this recursive dissociation can be seen as the fracta that produces conscious experience. So we just explained how that process emerges, and now recursive dissociation is the name of that specific fracta. And it's just used as a kind of a descriptor to help better convey what that process actually is. It's fairly simple, but we put it in the key terms, like I said, to help people understand it more clearly. Meta recursion, we talked about that, the act of recursion contemplating itself, hence meta. And like we just said, recursive dissociation can be seen as a form of fracta that produces meta recursion. The next is axiomatic erosion, and we already have described and talked about this concept as a law, the only quote unquote true law as suggested through the theory. But just to read it here to solidify it for you guys, axiomatic erosion is the universal law whereby attempts to establish foundational truths inevitably and necessarily dissolve into recursion, without exception, ultimately serving as a perpetual self reminder around the self contained nature of knowledge itself. This may also be understood as the inevitable breakdown of any axiom when subjected to sufficient examination, revealing that no absolute axioms may exist outside the perpetually dynamic interplay of recursion. Or we could also say that axiomatic erosion is the only axiom that exists, but it's little. The next few words here are associated with this idea of semantic synesthesia. So, just to briefly explain, you may or may not be familiar with the idea of synesthesia in general, and there are people out there who have experiences that, or they have phenomenological experiences in which there seems to be like a sensory crossover. So it expresses itself in all kinds of ways. Like, for example, some people will see numbers as colors, or like maybe you can taste or smell certain perceptions. It's a very interesting phenomenon, actually. And in this theory, we take that general idea of synesthesia and we explore how this sort of crossover of sensory experience, this fluid process of perpetual sensory experience, it doesn't just have to do with direct sensory inputs like colors or smells or sounds. It can actually extend into how your mind structures information and how you perceive and generate knowledge, like within one bound awareness. And without getting too abstract with explaining this, one of the points and the reasons we include it in the key terms section is because we explain how this ability or this process or whatever you want to call it actually allows a direct and almost immediate experience with the non-Euclidean structure of reality. In other words, you can sense the self-referential nature of phenomena on an extremely deep and like intuitive level in a way that almost inherently reveals the recursive nature of everything. And it's not necessarily everything all at once all the time, but it comes in flashes. It's an ability that can be developed and honed and applied and utilized in certain contexts, almost relating to the universal isomorphism as we talked about in the first section. So that kind of ties, you can tie those two concepts together, and see semantic synesthesia as the sensory or the subjective conscious process through which universal isomorphism might be employed. Next is cognitive geometry. So this also relates to semantic synesthesia by denoting the shapes or the structural geometry that appear in these isomorphic representations. So when you see self-similar shapes and expressions in reality, those shapes also reflect the structure of your own mind and your own awareness, because everything is a self-similar expression of the same fundamental pattern. So what that allows is, when you make this recognition, when you have this realization, you can intentionally embed those things and you can intentionally utilize this cognitive geometry to more definitively and more accurately perceive the world around you. and this is getting a lot, but the semantic synesthesia is actually one of the more it's a pretty abstract concept. So we won't spend too much time on explaining it because it's more so intended to demonstrate how these types of realizations can occur on the subjective level. And then the conceptual matrix, we just that's the exterior frame or the bound, the layer over which the cognitive geometry, the semantic synesthesia can take place. So, next is a very important concept that we introduce in this theory called maladaptive binding. And we just shorten this to malbinding because we use this term quite a bit throughout the theory, and it has a very nice, fluid sound to it, malbinding. Like it sounds like it fits perfectly almost. But we define this maladaptive binding process as a meta-recursive process where misaligned cognitive and emotional bindings become rigidly fixed and self reinforcing, leading to detrimental self sustaining cycles that disrupt healthy functioning. Malbinding occurs when incendent feedback loops are established within misaligned adjacent bounds, creating an unstable balance which can distort natural exendent processes and contribute to persistent mental health challenges such as anxiety, depression, and self harm. Now, first, it would be a really good time to mention or reiterate, because I don't know if I said this earlier, but another way to view the incendent force or the expression of incendent patterns is through feedback loops. Feedback loops are literally they are the observable expression of this incendent force, and they can be seen in so many different processes, such a wide range of phenomena and processes. From consciousness, feedback loops occur in your mind. They occur in nature. They occur in information systems and computer science, technology. Feedback loops are a descriptive element of recursive processing, and this actually reveals a lot of valuable things about how you can utilize these feedback loops to basically reach a whole range of experiential states and physical abilities and physical concentration. But that is all to say that within this specific context of the Mao binding process, what happens here is that a feedback loop, an incendent or a natural self-sustaining process, it becomes fixed or stuck within adjacent set of bounds that are misaligned or they are excendently bound. And there's some nuance when we get into talking about how these extendedly bound patterns manifest, because we have to remember that both types of forces manifest at any and every given scale. So in order to isolate them, we can do it through an approximate bound, but we run into to the temptation of saying that this is purely incendent, a purely extendent force. We have to keep in mind at all times that these are reflections, they're bound partial reflections of one pattern or one force. So within any given incendent process, there will be extendent patterns, and all differentiated expressions. So everything within what we have called the X sphere is already extendent in that it is differentiated. So the fact that it is outside of pure self-awareness, infinity, undifferentiated potential, however you want to describe that substrate, that fact, that differentiated state makes us extendent at a base level, at like a bound level. And then another kind of another kind of mind twisting thing to tie that together is that regarding the incendent bound processes, when we're denoting, describing, and expressing these things through like words and notation, the very act of binding them, expressing them, or acknowledging them gives it an incendent quality. So this actually maps cleanly onto when we talk about the notation, how the bounds work and how the bounds relate to each other. But any expression that is defined or approximated is by its very definition incendent because it has been bound in that way. It has been bound at a level. So even if you are observing extendent processes or like malbound feedback loops, if you're trying to study or look at addiction in human behavior, the very act of attempting to define it gives it an incendent quality. So we won't harp on that, but that's it is an important distinction if you're trying to understand those concepts as clearly as possible. And we will talk more about malbinding too, because when it comes to the psychological aspect and how these patterns are formed, like through the developmental stage of a human's life, it has some very, very direct implications. And that's part of the whole, the theory has an immense potential to aid and better people's lives through increasing self awareness. So, the maladaptive binding term is not only important, but it is largely intended to get people to think about how a lot of our problems really come from misaligned patterns. That's what it comes down to. So much of our emotional strain, our existential worry, our conflict with other people, they are all driven by malbound patterns, every single one of them. And we'll never be able to live in a purely, perfectly theoretical world where everyone gets along all the time, because there are harsh conditions. There are constraints that you can't always step out of them, and you can't always be perfect, and you are going to be subject to emotions and habits and actions and all that stuff. But recognizing what's going on and recognizing that process is the first step to reducing it on like a mass scale. And the incredible thing is, this is like no other, what do you want to call it? It's like no other proposition ever, because it doesn't require any forced participation. The knowledge speaks for itself and the patterns express themselves. And once you realize it, once you recognize it, you can't unrecognize it. That's what makes the theory self-proving. It is almost obvious in hindsight, but it just takes a while to fully grasp how all these pieces fit together in a coherent and internally consistent way. But if you have faith and you know that they do, that process will occur much more quickly. I promise you that. So moving on from maladaptive binding, we have a few more words here. Which ones of these? Okay, so we'll talk about the subtotem, because this is also a very important term on the psychological level. But what this is here, we're speaking of ascendant patterns. I have to update the theory because I just had this thought recently. But what the subtotem can be seen and expressed as basically the inscendent structure of any self-aware process or a consciousness. So if you're a person, if you're a self-aware, self-reflecting entity, there is a bound that kind of anchors you. It anchors everything you do. It anchors everything you see. It isn't anything, it can't be explicitly defined, because we already know nothing can be explicitly defined. But it can be seen as like the tether that anchors the structure of your patterns to the structure of reality. And it has physical expressions, it has physical components. Your body is the physical manifestation of your subtotem, but the thing itself is actually deeper than that, because it consists of all ascendantly bound patterns. So all internal expressions that are define a person's makeup, really define an awareness's makeup. So I think Jung actually, he had a word for this. He studied it and he wrote about it a bit. I He called it the daimon. I think it's called the daimon, or the daemon, or maybe it was a demon. I don't know for sure, but it was this idea of a natural force that you had to negotiate with. You had to recognize and negotiate with. And this subtotem is very, very similar to that notion. It is, you can absolutely say that this is a natural force that tethers you to reality that you have to recognize and negotiate with. And once you recognize it's there, and once you know that it is something not to be identified with, but to be interacted with, that changes everything. It changes absolutely everything. And it profoundly and elegantly ties in so many different like philosophies and perspectives, from spiritual, non-dual, and even religious teachings. Like, it encompasses so much truth in a profoundly simple way. And if it doesn't, then I'm willing to expand on how that might be explained further. But the way that I see it right now, and after now having engaged these ideas for months, it's like clear at a level that's almost startling. So I'm not sure if I should. Yeah, well, we won't do that one. Okay, we're gonna skip to the externum. So now that we're getting to the end here, it's getting a little bit deeper, a little bit heavier, but this is important because it, obviously has direct implications for human life and how we perceive death. So once we recognize that reality is recursive and that everything extends out from a pure undifferentiated pattern or undifferentiated potential, that naturally raises the question of, all right, what happens then after we die? And first of all, I just want to say, I hope my goal, and I am happy and relieved to say that this offers a profoundly hopeful view on this whole topic. And to put it simply, to try to simplify it, think about it like this, okay? We call it recursive dissociation because what consciousness is a dissociated bound from a perfect pattern, a perfectly unified pattern. That's what it is. And what happens when you are born and you live and you're out walking around and you have a life and then you eventually die one day? I mean, obviously it's a natural process, but there are also very natural fears and anxieties to be had around that process because of the uncertainty aspect. And there's this thing called terror management theory, which it suggests that a lot of the fear and anxiety around death is ego driven. And I'm sure a lot of the perspectives and attitudes, they certainly are ego driven, but I always thought that that was a naive, or not a naive, but it was a unfair, no, maybe it was a naive theory in principle, because I think the actual reason, and a very justified reason behind a lot of anxiety around death, is the aspect of uncertainty, because you don't know what's going to happen. There's no possible way for you to know what's going to happen. And even if we achieve proper, perfect, recursive self awareness, we have to admit by necessity that whatever is happening or whatever that perfect awareness is, it is infinite. So, whatever state we're in, the differentiated forms that we take can never fully see it, to put it most simply. But it's, in my perspective, it is both hopeful and liberating exactly because it tells us and it shows us that there's no such thing as like nothing. Yeah, you, when you die, you don't dissolve into the void. It's not a matter of, so here's something I can relate to. Like, all those things that you care about and enjoy, your memories, the loved ones, everything that you are like afraid of leaving behind realistically, like the best moments in life. Um, what happens when you die, according to the logic of the theory, is that you are returning back to the perfect expression, to the perfect awareness, and you're returning back to the quote unquote place, because I mean, all spatial definition just loses its meaning here. It means absolutely nothing. But you are returning to a perfectly inscendent state, a pure, undifferentiated potential. And in this state, let's just put it this way: every feeling, every emotion that you have that makes you feel like life is worth living, those feelings and those sensations, those are derivations from the inscendent place that you will go when you die. They are partial representations of an ultimate unified awareness, an ultimate feeling, not even a feeling, that's a wrong way to put it, a pure undifferentiation. So like, I'm trying to describe it right here. I'm trying to do my best. I think I'm conveying through my failure that it is not something that can be contained. This whole framework is an attempt to contain something that cannot be contained. But the part of how it does so is by admitting and acknowledging our permanent removal from that relationship of truth, or at least absolute or explicit truth. So the idea that because we are our brains and our bodies, and everything that we are is simply a material particle accumulation that kind of just dissolves when we die. I mean, that is technically what happens to our bodies, but it is literally looking at a specific bound of expression. You are missing everything else about what's actually happening. And when you, as a person, when your alter dies on Earth, the process that's really taking place is just not something that we're able to perceive or conceive of or talk about coherently, because we already know, we've already admitted, these states manifest infinitely and in ways that we simply cannot comprehend. And because we are returning to a place of pure alignment, pure coherence and integration, there will be a process of forced realignment. Or, I mean, I have to be honest, I don't know what that process looks like. I don't know. I can't tell you how it occurs, or like, I can't give you details, but that is what the math and the logic suggests, is that when you die and the external process happens, the dissociated bound that you have existed within and that was your conscious experience, the bound dissolves, and the incendent patterns, the incendent coherence that was retained within that bound, that doesn't just die. It's reintegrated back into the place from which it emerged, the pure coherence from which it emerged, pure undifferentiated potential. So while we can never truly know what it's going to be like, we can confidently take a profoundly different and positively hopeful view that the actions and the way that we live our lives, from a daily basis to our relationships to our sincerest existential dread, these are all negotiations that have an output. They play a role in a deeper process.